She gave up everything to keep them alive. And the one man she never stopped loving just walked through her door. 9 years of silence, 9 years of flower-dusted hands and quiet sunrises, and a name that wasn't really hers. Elena Cross built a life from nothing, shaped it with her bare hands the same way she shaped bread. Slow, deliberate, careful not to let it break. She thought she'd buried the past deep enough that it could never find her. She was wrong. If this story already has you holding your breath, hit that like button right now, drop your city in the comments below, and let me see exactly how far this story has traveled. Now stay with me, because what happens next will change everything you think you know about love, survival, and the price of the truth. The rain came in sideways off the Atlantic, the kind of rain that didn't fall so much as a tack. Sheets of it slapping against the plate glass windows of the Saltline Bakery like an accusation. Elena Cross had been awake since 4 in the morning. She always was. The hours between 4 and 7 belonged to her in a way nothing else did. The kitchen warm and flour-dusted and smelling of brown butter and cardamom, the twins still asleep upstairs in the apartment above the shop. Those hours were hers to be no one in particular, just a woman with her hands in dough. She was pulling a tray of sourdough boules from the lower oven when she heard the front door open. She hadn't unlocked it yet. She was certain of that. She reached the lock every morning at precisely 6:45, wiped her hands on her apron first, turned the bolt with her left hand because the right one had a scar across the palm that ached in cold weather, and she hadn't done any of that yet. It was not yet 6. She straightened up slowly, set the tray on the cooling rack without a sound, reached to the left of the oven where the heavy-handled bread knife rested on its magnetic strip, and pulled it down in one practiced motion. The man standing inside her front door was soaking wet. His dark jacket was plastered to his shoulders, his dark hair flattened against his forehead, his chest rising and falling too fast for someone who'd simply walked in from the rain. He had his back to her, watching the street through the fogged glass of the door. His right hand hung at his side. In it was a gun. Elena's body went somewhere cold and very far away. Her lungs forgot what they were for, because she knew that hand. She knew the way the knuckle of the middle finger sat slightly wider than the others from a break that hadn't healed right. She knew the way his shoulders sat, left higher than the right, almost imperceptible. A thing you only noticed if you'd spent years sleeping beside him and learning his body the way you learned a language. She knew him the way you know a scar, by its exact shape, by the particular way it still hurt. Damien Voss turned around. He looked older. That was the first thing her brain processed, because her brain was trying very hard to do something useful instead of shutting down entirely. There were lines at the corners of his eyes now, carved in by something harder than age. His jaw carried more shadow than it used to, but the eyes were the same. That particular shade of steel gray, the color of water just before a storm, eyes that had always seemed to be calculating something even when the rest of his face was still. Those eyes found her. Stopped. Neither of them moved. Outside, the rain hammered the windows. Somewhere down the street, a car alarm was going off, quick and frantic, and then it stopped. "Elena." His voice was exactly the same, low, controlled. It barely moved, that voice, like it was conserving something. She was still holding the bread knife. She didn't put it down. "You need to leave," she said. Her voice was steadier than she deserved it to be. "I'm not here for you." He said it without expression, which meant nothing because Damien Voss had never once in his life led with his expression. There were 3 men on Carver Street. I lost 2 of them in the alley behind the fish market, but the third one is still out there. I need 60 seconds. You need to leave my bakery. Elena, don't. She said it sharply, one syllable, like a door slamming. Don't say my name like that. Don't stand in my store. Don't breathe in my store. Get out. He looked at her for a long moment. She watched him do what she remembered him always doing, say, taking inventory, reading the room, reading her. His eyes moved to the bread knife in her hand, then back to her face. And something shifted in his expression. Not softness. Damien Voss didn't do softness. But something that looked like recognition. Like he was finding the edges of something he'd been searching for. "You're afraid," he said. I'm angry. You're both. He moved then, just slightly, away from the door. Not toward her, just away from the glass, putting himself at an angle where he couldn't be seen from the street. Pure instinct, the same instinct that had kept him alive for 15 years in an empire built on violence and debt, and the particular brutality of men who believed power was the only honest currency. How long have you been here? She said nothing. How long, Elena? 8 years. She didn't know why she answered. Maybe because the lie was bigger than she had energy for at 6 a.m. with bread cooling on the rack and her daughters asleep above her head. 8.5? He was quiet for a moment. Outside, a second car alarm started, then a third. His jaw tightened. That's not rain, he said very quietly. She heard it then, underneath the storm, a sound that her body recognized before her mind did. 3 quick percussive cracks from somewhere east of the square. Her brain wanted to tell her it was a car backfiring. Her body knew better. Her body had spent 3 years in Damien Voss's world before it knew how to get out. Back door, she said. She hated herself for saying it. Where does it go? Service alley. There's a loading gate at the end. It opens onto Belmont. You can get to the harbor from there. He was already moving toward the kitchen. He stopped at the threshold and turned back. And for one completely irrational second, she thought he was going to say something that mattered, something that cut through 9 years of silence and missing, and the particular grief of loving someone you had to disappear from. The knife, he said. Keep it close. Then he was gone through her kitchen, past her oven and her cooling racks and her life. And the back door opened and shut with a sound like punctuation, and Elena stood in the middle of her bakery with flour on her hands and a bread knife she was gripping hard enough to leave marks on her palm. She stood there for exactly 4 seconds. Then she heard the floor creak above her head, the particular creak of the third board from the top of the stairs. And she made herself breathe, and she put the knife back on its strip, and she went to put the kettle on because Ivy and Noelle were waking up, and they needed breakfast, and the world still had to work like the world. She didn't sleep that night. She hadn't expected to. She sat at the kitchen table after the girls were in bed, and she drank tea she didn't taste, and she thought about the way Damien's eyes had landed on her and stayed, the way a thing stays when it's been looking for a long time and finally found what it was looking for. She thought about the gun in his hand and the men in the street, and she thought about the decision she had made 9 years ago, standing in a hospital room in Chicago with 2 pink-faced newborns asleep in a shared bassinet and a phone call playing in her memory on a loop. She'd made the right choice. She told herself that every day for 9 years. She told herself that now. She didn't entirely believe it. In the morning, the rain had stopped, which meant nothing because the worst things in Elena's experience had always arrived in good weather. She opened the bakery at 7 as usual. She sent Ivy and Noelle to school at 8:15, standing at the corner until the crosswalk light changed, and she watched them cross, their matching dark ponytails swinging, their nearly identical profiles turned toward each other as they talked. They were 9 years old, and they argued constantly about everything except the things that mattered, where they were inexplicably, perfectly aligned. She watched them until they disappeared through the school gate. She went back to the bakery and made herself useful. By 10, she had sold out of the almond croissants and was halfway through a second tray of morning rolls when the door opened and she looked up, expecting Mrs. Callahan from the insurance office across the street, who came every Tuesday for the same thing, and instead found 2 men in dark clothing standing just inside the door. They weren't buying bread. She knew this the way you know certain things, without processing, without argument. The knowledge arrived whole. She kept her hands moving on the tray of rolls and said, "I'll be right with you," in her most ordinary voice, and with her back to them, she reached below the counter and pressed the small button mounted to the underside of the register shelf. In the apartment upstairs, a red light would be blinking. The girls weren't there. They were at school. But the button also tripped the exterior camera she'd mounted on the side of the building 6 years ago, the one that recorded and uploaded continuously to a server in a city she'd never been to. She'd installed it because she'd always known, in the part of her that never fully relaxed, that a day like this might come. She turned around. The taller of the 2 men had a face like a clenched fist, compact features, nothing to hold on to, the kind of face that forgot itself as soon as you looked away from it. He was the one who spoke. "You had a visitor last night. Where did he go?" "I don't know what you're talking about." She set the tray on the counter, met his eyes. "Can I get you something?" The second man was moving along the wall, past the display case, toward the kitchen door. Elena's pulse spiked, but she kept her face neutral. She'd learned that from Damien, actually. Learned it by watching him move through rooms where everyone wanted something from him. Learned it by watching him never once let his face give anyone the satisfaction of knowing they'd landed somewhere. She learned a lot of things from Damien Voss. Most of them she'd have preferred not to need. "Lady," the first man said. He didn't raise his voice. That was worse, somehow. "We don't want trouble. We want to know where he went." "I was here alone all night," she said. "Baking." He looked at her for a long time. She looked back. Then the second man came out of the kitchen and shook his head slightly, and the first man held her gaze for another 2 seconds that felt significantly longer, and then they left. Elena turned back to her tray of rolls. Her hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against the counter until they stopped. She picked the girls up herself that afternoon. She told them school was fine and the bakery was fine, and yes, they could have the leftover maple scones from the morning batch. And she sat at the kitchen table while they did homework, and she watched them and tried to remember how she'd gotten to a place where this felt like enough. Where flour-dusted counters and a small apartment above a bakery in a coastal town nobody had ever heard of felt like a life worth protecting. It wasn't enough. It had never been enough. It was what she'd chosen instead of them dying. Ivy looked up from her math worksheet. She had her father's coloring, the dark hair, the gray eyes, that particular quality of stillness that could, at 9 years old, already feel unsettling in a person so small. Noelle was the same, feature for feature, but she moved differently. Where Ivy was still, Noelle was constant motion, a quality of restless energy that Elena privately recognized as her own. "Mom," Ivy said. "Yeah. You're doing the thing where you're looking at us, but you're not actually here." Elena blinked. "Sorry, I'm here. Is something wrong?" "No." The lie came easily. It always did. She'd been lying to her daughters for 9 years about the most important thing there was, which meant smaller lies came out smooth as water. "Eat your scone." He came back at 11:15 that night. She was still at the table with her cold tea when she heard the soft knock at the back door. 3 quick, 1 slow. And she sat very still for a moment with her hands around her mug, and she thought about not answering, and she thought about answering with the bread knife, and then she got up and opened the door. Damien was drier than he'd been that morning, but not by much. He had a cut above his right eyebrow that had been dealt with imperfectly. Someone had pressed something against it to stop the bleeding, but it needed actual attention. He was in different clothes. He looked exactly as dangerous as she remembered him looking when things had gotten difficult, which was to say very. And the fact that she felt something complicated and unwelcome at the sight of him told her things about herself she'd rather not know. "You should have left town," she said. "I know." "Why didn't you?" He stepped inside. She didn't stop him. He looked around her kitchen the way he always looked at spaces, cataloging exits, windows, lines of sight, the information absorbed in seconds and filed without apparent effort. Then he looked at her. "2 men came here this morning," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." "Did they hurt you?" "No." Something crossed his face. "Good." She pulled out the chair across from her own and sat back down. After a moment, he sat in the chair she'd offered. He put the gun on the table between them, butt first, and she looked at it and then back at him. "The men in the street," she said. "Who sent them?" "Marcus Hale." The name landed in the room like something dropped. She'd heard it before, from a lifetime ago, from the world she'd left. Marcus Hale had been Damien's lieutenant for 6 years, his fixer. The man who handled the things that couldn't be handled cleanly. Why would Marcus— "Because I found out," Damien said, "what he did. 2 months ago. It took me 9 years to find the thread, Elena. 9 years to find the single piece that made everything else make sense." He was looking at her across the table, and his expression was doing something she hadn't seen before. Something that wasn't quite steady. On Damien Voss's face, that was the equivalent of another man's complete unraveling. The call you got. The night you disappeared. I know who made it. Elena felt the blood drain out of her face. She felt it go in a slow wave, felt the cold follow it, and she pressed her hands flat on the table surface, the same way she'd pressed them against the counter that morning. Damien. It was Marcus. His voice was very quiet, that terrifying quiet. He made the call. He told you the girls were targets. He told you that if you stayed, they would be used against me. He told you disappearing was the only way to keep them alive. She couldn't speak. Her throat had closed around something that wasn't sound. He played both of us, Damien said. He needed me without you. He needed me focused and cold and convinced that the woman I trusted had run with my children because she didn't trust me to protect them. He needed to fracture the one thing that might have made me human enough to be managed. He paused. And he needed you afraid and alone and running for 9 years. The kitchen was very quiet. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, far away, something moved on the water. Elena said, "The girls." "Yes." "He knows about them." "Yes." "How long has he known?" Damien looked at her across the table, and she understood from his expression that she wasn't going to like this answer. "Long enough," he said. "He let you have 8 years of quiet because they were too young to matter yet. They're 9 now, old enough to be used, old enough for people in my world to look at them and see something worth leveraging." She was on her feet before she'd decided to move, standing with both hands on the table and something cold and clarifying moving through her chest that wasn't fear exactly. She'd been afraid before, and it didn't feel like this. This felt like the moment just before a decision. "You need to leave tonight," she said. "Right now. You need to walk out of my bakery and draw every one of Marcus Hale's men as far away from this town as possible. And you need to do it before my daughters wake up in the morning." "Elena, don't. They know where you are." He said it flat, the way you said something true that you wish wasn't. "They knew before I did. I didn't lead them here. They were already here. My arrival just accelerated the timeline." The refrigerator hummed. Elena stared at the tabletop. "They'll move on this town in the next 48 hours, Damien said. "On the bakery, on the apartment, on the school." He let that sit for exactly 1 second. "I'm the only person alive who has enough information about Marcus's network to dismantle it before it can move. And I can't do it from a distance with people hunting me. I need time. A few days. And I need to not be alone." She looked up at him. He held her gaze. "I need you," he said. "And I need them somewhere safe." She laughed. It came out wrong. Half a laugh, half something that didn't have a name. "You need me. After 9 years. You show up in my kitchen at midnight after I built a life for your daughters from the ground up with nothing. And you need me." "Yes. You're a piece of work, Damien." "I know." She turned away from him, stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the dark water and the lit windows of the houses along the harbor, and her town, her quiet, safe, unremarkable town that she had chosen because it was the last place anyone who'd ever known Damien Voss would think to look. She'd been right about that for 8.5 years. Time had run out. She thought about Ivy's math worksheet on the table, Noelle's half-eaten maple scone, the way they'd looked crossing the street that morning, their ponytails swinging, their heads tipped toward each other, unbothered by anything, the specific, untroubled quality of children who don't know yet that the world is the way it is. She thought about what she would do if something happened to them. She already knew the answer. She'd known it since the night she'd held them in a hospital room in Chicago and understood, completely and without appeal, that she would burn anything down to keep them breathing. She turned back around. "If you make one decision that puts them at risk," she said, "one, I will not forgive you. I don't care what it costs." Damien Voss looked at her across her kitchen and said, very quietly, "Neither will I." She looked at him for a long moment, searching for the lie. She'd spent 3 years learning to read him and 9 years trying to forget that she knew how. And what she found in his face now was what she found so rarely in the early years that she'd always remembered it clearly. She found that he meant exactly what he said. "There's a fold-out in the back room," she said. "I'll wake the girls at 4. We need to be out of town before light." She turned off the kitchen light and went upstairs to start packing what they couldn't leave behind. Behind her, she heard Damien Voss sit back down at her table, and she heard him breathe, long and slow and careful, like a man learning, at the very last possible moment, how to be afraid of the right things. Above her head, the floorboards were silent. Her daughters were still sleeping. For now. Elena packed like someone who had practiced it, because she had. Not obsessively. She wasn't the kind of woman who kept a bag by the door and checked it every morning. But she had made the mental inventory so many times over the years, lying awake in the apartment above the bakery while the girls slept, and the harbor made its sounds, and the old fear moved through her chest like weather, that her hands knew what to reach for before her brain gave the order. Birth certificates in the fireproof box under the floorboard in the closet, the cash envelope behind the water heater, $4,200, rebuilt slowly over years whenever she had something extra. The external drive with the photos, the passport she'd had made 7 years ago through a contact she'd paid very well to forget her. She did not pack the wedding photograph she'd kept folded in the back of her sock drawer for 8.5 years. She thought about it. She left it. She woke the girls at 4:15. Noelle came awake fighting, the way she always did, surfacing from sleep like something breaking through ice, gasping, disoriented, reaching immediately for the lamp. Ivy was the opposite. Ivy opened her eyes in the dark and looked at Elena and didn't say anything for a moment and then said, "We're leaving, aren't we?" It wasn't a question. "Get dressed," Elena told her. "Warm layers, shoes you can run in." Noelle sat up. "Run? Mom, what?" "Clothes first, questions after." Elena was already at the door. 5 minutes. She went downstairs. Damien was where she'd left him, at the kitchen table, though he'd moved the chair so his back was to the wall, and he could see both the back door and the stairwell simultaneously. He hadn't slept. She could see it in the particular quality of his stillness, the way a person holds themselves when they've been fighting to stay conscious for too long. He'd been on a gun and his own nerves for hours. "They're up," she said. He nodded. He looked toward the stairwell. "Don't." She said it before she'd decided to. "Not yet. Give them 5 minutes to just be getting dressed before they have to deal with—" She gestured at him, at all of it, the whole impossible situation. "Just give them 5 minutes." His jaw tightened fractionally. He nodded again. She went to the register and took out the cash drawer and emptied it into her bag. $340, mostly 10s and 20s from yesterday's sales. She went back to the kitchen and turned off the pilot light on the oven. She unplugged the refrigerator, which was a ridiculous thing to think about under the circumstances, and she stood there with the cord in her hand and understood that she was doing this because looking at the ordinary details of the life she was leaving kept her from looking at the size of what was actually happening. She put the cord down. Ivy appeared in the kitchen doorway first. Dark-haired, gray-eyed, backpack on both shoulders, wearing the navy pullover and the waterproof boots she used for camping trips. She looked at Damien Voss sitting at the kitchen table and she went completely still. Noelle ran into her from behind. "Ivy, why are you—" She stopped, looked around her sister, looked at Damien. The kitchen was very quiet. Damien looked at the two of them. Elena watched his face do something she had never seen it do before. He was not a man who lost composure. She had seen him walk through things that would have dismantled anyone else and come out the other side with his face giving nothing away. But looking at Ivy and Noelle in the kitchen doorway at 4 in the morning with their backpacks on, he went somewhere briefly that she couldn't follow. Something crossed his face that had no name in the language of the life he'd lived. He recovered in under 2 seconds. But she saw it. "Who are you?" Noelle demanded. She had never once in 9 years been afraid of a stranger before she'd decided whether they deserved it. "A friend of your mother's," Damien said. "You don't look like her friends." "Noelle," Elena said. "He has a gun on the table, Mom." "I know. Come get your jackets from the hook and let's go." Ivy hadn't said anything. She was still looking at Damien with that unsettling gray-eyed stillness. Damien looked back at her. Elena watched something pass between them that she didn't have words for and that made her chest hurt in a way she was going to have to think about later, much later, when there was time. Ivy, Elena said it gently. Jacket. Ivy blinked, moved, said nothing. But Damien had a car 2 blocks over, a dark blue sedan, nothing distinctive, the kind of car that disappeared in traffic. Elena didn't ask where it had come from. They put the girls in the back and Elena in the passenger seat and Damien behind the wheel, and they left Salt Line before 4:30, before the first gray light touched the water, before the first fishing boat left the harbor, and Elena watched the bakery disappear in the side mirror and said nothing. In the back seat, Noelle lasted approximately 8 minutes before she said, "Someone needs to tell us what's happening." "We're going on a trip," Elena said. "Mom, I'm 9, not 4. There are some people who want to find your—" Elena stopped, started again. "Who want to find us. We're going somewhere safe until that's sorted out." "Who wants to find us? Why?" Elena glanced at Damien. He kept his eyes on the road. "It's complicated," Elena said. "Try," Ivy said from the window side of the back seat. She hadn't looked away from the passing dark since they'd gotten in. The car was quiet for a moment. Damien's hands on the wheel were very still. "The man driving us," Elena said carefully, "is someone I knew a long time ago, before you were born. There are people who want to hurt him, and because you and I are connected to him, those people might try to use us to get to him." "Connected how?" Noelle said. Another silence. Elena could feel the shape of it pressing in from all sides. "He's your father," Ivy said. Flat, certain, not a question. The car filled up with that statement and stayed full. Noelle made a sound she immediately stopped making. Outside, the highway opened up ahead of them, empty and dark. "Ivy," Elena started. "He has the same eyes as us." Ivy's voice was steady, in a way that wasn't natural in a 9-year-old. That was something else, something learned or inherited. "The exact same color. I noticed in the kitchen." Elena couldn't speak. She turned forward and looked at the windshield. "Is that true?" Noelle asked. Her voice was different now, smaller, the bravado gone. Damien said, "Yes." Just the one word. Another long silence. "Okay," Noelle said finally. The word came out shaky and then steadied. "Okay. We can be mad about this later. What do we do right now?" Elena felt something break open in her chest and immediately seal itself back shut because they didn't have time. "Right now we get somewhere safe. Then we figure out the rest." "Okay," Noelle said again. She reached over and took Ivy's hand in the back seat. Ivy let her. Elena stared at the road ahead and held herself together with both hands. Damien drove them 3 hours inland to a town called Merritt Falls, which was exactly the kind of town that existed to be driven through. 2 gas stations, a diner, a motel that had stopped being renovated sometime around 2003 and had given up pretending otherwise. He pulled into the lot of the motel and got 2 rooms at the back, paid cash, and came out with the keycards moving fast, his eyes scanning the lot out of habit. Elena got the girls settled in one room. They were exhausted and shaken and trying not to show it, and she sat on the edge of the bed between them for a while and didn't say much because there wasn't much to say that was useful. Noelle eventually fell asleep sitting up, and Elena eased her horizontal. Ivy lay down, but her eyes stayed open, fixed on the ceiling. "You could have told us," Ivy said. "I know. Why didn't you?" Elena looked at her daughter in the weak lamplight. Those impossible gray eyes, that stillness. "Because I thought knowing would put you in danger. Not knowing didn't exactly keep us safe." "No," Elena said. "It didn't." Ivy looked at the ceiling for another moment. Then she closed her eyes. Elena sat there until she was sure both girls were asleep, and then she went next door. Damien had the road atlas out on the bed, which struck her as almost funny. Of everything she'd expected, the paper atlas hadn't been on the list. He also had a laptop open and a burner phone and what appeared to be a half-eaten granola bar, which told her he hadn't eaten properly in at least a day. "Marcus's network," she said. She sat in the chair by the window. "You said you had information." "I have some of it." He didn't look up from the atlas. "Enough to know the architecture, not enough to take it down." "What do you still need?" There's a man named Garrett Foles. He managed Marcus's financial infrastructure for 6 years. Accounts, transfers, the shell companies Marcus used to clean syndicate money. I had a conversation with him 8 weeks ago before he disappeared. Before I knew he'd been spooked into running. Damien tapped a point on the atlas, somewhere in Pennsylvania, a junction of 2 rural routes. 3 days ago, I got a message from a number I didn't recognize. Foles. He said he wanted out and he had documentation, hard copies, not digital. Everything Marcus has built since he took over. Names, amounts, the offshore structures. Enough to bury him. Where is he? 40 miles from here. Or was, when he sent the message. When did you get the message? Yesterday morning. Elena looked at him. While you were in Salt Line? Yes. She absorbed that. So you knew when you came through my door that you were 40 miles from someone who could end this. I didn't know you were in Salt Line. I was in Salt Line because that's where the ambush caught me, which is where Marcus's men herded me, which I only understood was deliberate in the last 6 hours. His voice was flat with a particular kind of tiredness, the tiredness of someone who'd been played at a high level and knew it. They drove me to you deliberately. They knew you were there. They wanted to see what you'd do when you saw me, whether you'd run, who you'd call. They were using me as a finder. Elena sat with that for a long, cold moment. They followed you to Salt Line to find me, she said, and then they came into my bakery to confirm it. Yes. And now they know exactly where we were. They knew 2 hours before we left. He finally looked up at her. I'm sorry, Elena. She didn't want the apology. It didn't fit anywhere in the architecture of what she was feeling. You said Marcus wants the girls, specifically. Why now? Why not 3 years ago, 5 years ago? Because 3 years ago, I didn't know they existed, and Marcus needed me not knowing. He paused. The syndicate has been fracturing for 2 years, rival factions testing the structure. Marcus has held it together, but only barely, and the reason it's fracturing is that people don't follow Marcus Hale the way they followed me. They followed me because... He stopped. Because they were afraid of you, Elena said. Because they believed I had something to protect. He said it without self-pity, which was worse. Marcus has money and leverage. He doesn't have that. The moment word spreads that I have heirs, that there are 2 children with Voss blood who can be used as a flag to rally the factions that have been drifting, they become assets, or targets, depending on which faction gets to them first. Elena pressed her hands together in her lap. She thought about Ivy and Noelle asleep next door, and she thought about the words assets and targets applied to her daughters, and she made herself breathe. I want them out of this country, she said. I know. Before anything else, before Foles, before Marcus, I want them somewhere Marcus's reach doesn't extend. I have a contact in Montreal. No. She said it before he finished. Not someone from your world, someone from mine. I have a person. He looked at her. You have a person. Did you think I spent 9 years in a coastal town with no contingency plan? She held his gaze. I have a woman named Ruth in Halifax. She was a social worker before she retired. She knows what I am and what I was, and she has a house with a basement that has one exterior door that opens to her backyard, which is surrounded by 6 feet of solid fence, and she has 2 Rottweilers and a very calm disposition. I've had an agreement with her for 5 years. If I call her, she takes the girls. No questions, no contact with anyone, no record. Damien looked at her for a long moment. You've been planning an exit for 5 years, he said. I've been planning for the eventuality that the exit I already made wasn't permanent, she said. There's a difference. He was quiet. Then, make the call. She called Ruth from the motel room bathroom with the water running. Ruth picked up on the second ring, which meant she'd been awake, which told Elena something about Ruth's own contingency plans and the kind of woman she was. It's me, Elena said. I know, Ruth said. How many? 2. Tonight, if possible. I'll have the back room ready. How far out? We're in Merritt Falls. I'll need someone to drive them to you. I'll send my nephew. He's been briefed. He'll have a blue pickup. Plate starts with 741. Don't let them get in any other vehicle. How long? 3 hours, less if he pushes it. Tell him to push it. She came out of the bathroom. Damien was at the window, just the edge of the curtain moved, watching the parking lot. 3 hours, she said. He nodded. He didn't look away from the window. We have company. She was at his side in 3 steps and looked through the gap in the curtain. A black SUV had pulled into the lot and parked facing the building, engine still running. No one had gotten out. Side exit? She said. Down the hall past the ice machine. How do you... I mapped the building when we checked in. Of course he had. Elena let the curtain fall back. I need 2 more hours with the girls before his nephew gets here. You have 90 minutes. Then we need to move the car. Already thinking it. He turned from the window. There's a diner across the highway. If we move the car there, they'll hold on the motel for a while before they confirm we've relocated. And when they confirm? We're already 3 miles down the road. With the girls? With the girls. Until his nephew takes them, they stay with us. He met her eyes. I won't let them out of my sight, Elena. She looked at him. She thought about the way his face had moved when he'd first seen them in the kitchen doorway. She thought about 9 years and all the things she'd carried alone and the particular loneliness of being the only person in the world who loved 2 specific human beings and had no one to share that weight with. You don't get to say that like it means something yet, she said. I know. You have to earn it. I know that too. She looked at him for another beat. Then she went to wake the girls. Gut. They made it to the diner. 90 minutes of bad coffee and scrambled eggs, and the girls sitting in the booth across from Damien with the specific quality of attention children give to something they're trying to understand. Noelle asked questions. She couldn't help herself. She'd been constructed that way, assembled from a quality of relentless curiosity that Elena had spent years trying to channel into harmless things. She asked Damien what he did. He said business. She asked what kind. He said complicated. She said that's what people say when they don't want to answer. He said she was right. Ivy ate her eggs and said nothing and watched him. At one point, Damien reached across the table for the salt and his sleeve rode up, and Ivy looked at the scar on his forearm. Long and old, and the specific white of something that had healed decades ago. And she reached out and touched it with 2 fingers, quickly, the way you'd touch something to confirm it was real. Damien went very still. Ivy pulled her hand back. Sorry, she said. She didn't sound sorry. She sounded like someone who'd confirmed something. It's all right, Damien said. His voice had done something. Elena looked out the window at the highway. Basim. The blue pickup arrived at 6:47 in the morning. The nephew was 20-something and quiet and had an honest face, which Elena had long since learned meant almost nothing but felt like something. He had the right plate number. He said the right words Ruth had told Elena he would say. Elena checked twice anyway. She took the girls outside. Noelle hugged her immediately, arms tight, face pressed against Elena's shoulder. Elena held her and breathed her in, shampoo and maple sugar and the particular smell of her daughter that she'd known since the first second of her life. How long? Noelle asked. I don't know. Not long. That's not an answer. I know. I'm sorry. Noelle pulled back. Her eyes were red, but she wasn't crying. Don't get hurt, she said. I mean it. I won't. She looked at Ivy. Ivy stood slightly apart, her backpack on, her face doing the thing Elena could never entirely read. She came forward, and Elena held her, and Ivy stood in the hug like something that had been rigid for a long time, learning how to relax. The man, Ivy said quietly against Elena's shoulder. Is he going to stay? Elena didn't have an answer to that either. We'll figure it out. Ivy pulled back. She looked past Elena to where Damien was standing by the diner entrance, hands in his jacket pockets, watching the road. She looked at him for a long moment with those impossible gray eyes. Then she turned and got in the blue pickup. Elena stood in the parking lot and watched the truck pull out onto the highway, and she kept watching it until it was gone, and then she stood there a little longer anyway. Damien came and stood beside her. He didn't say anything. If anything happens to them, she said, nothing will happen to them. I'm not finished. If anything happens to them, I will not forgive you. I won't forgive myself. And I will burn down whatever is left of your world, and I will salt the ground after. I know, he said. She turned and looked at him. His face in the early morning light was older than she'd let herself see in the kitchen the night before. Lines and shadows and something worn through, the way metal wears when it's been under pressure for too long. Tell me about Foles, she said. Everything. Now. Garrett Foles was living in a farmhouse 22 miles southwest of Merritt Falls, according to the address attached to the burner message. He'd used a burn phone to contact Damien, which meant he was scared but not stupid, and scared but not stupid was the most useful kind of person in a situation like this. They took the sedan and drove with the windows up and the radio off. Elena watched the side mirror. Damien drove with one hand and kept the other near the gun on the seat between them. When's the last time you slept? She asked. Tuesday. It's Thursday. I know. You're going to make mistakes. I know that too. She watched the fields go by. October bare, flat, the sky an unimpressive gray. Marcus has been running your organization for 9 years. What's left of it? And the factions that are drifting? They know you're alive? Some of them, the ones Marcus hasn't been able to control, have been putting out quiet inquiries for 18 months. Looking for me. He paused. Marcus has been telling people I went underground voluntarily, that I handed him the operation by choice. And they believed him? They believed him because the alternative was that he'd taken it from me and was lying about it, and that meant they were working for a man who'd deposed the head of the Voss syndicate without anyone noticing, and that was a terrifying enough idea that believing the lie was more comfortable. Elena thought about that. But they're starting not to believe it. The factions are destabilizing. 2 of them have made contact with people they think might get a message to me. They want to know if I'm coming back. Are you? He was quiet for a moment. The road stretched ahead of them, empty and gray. No, he said. Not the way they mean. She looked at him. He kept his eyes on the road. The documents Foles has, she said. If they're what you say, if they lay out the full financial infrastructure, the shell companies, the accounts, you could go to the federal task force. I know. That means Marcus goes to prison. The syndicate gets dismantled. Yes. And you? Another silence, longer this time. And me, he said. She understood what he wasn't saying. She'd understood it since the kitchen 2 nights ago. There was no version of this where Damien walked away clean. Whatever he handed to federal authorities would implicate him as thoroughly as it implicated Marcus. More in some ways, because his name was the one attached to 9 years of the Voss syndicate's operation in the public record. Going to the authorities meant dismantling his own legacy brick by brick. It meant exposure. It meant legal consequence. It meant the end of everything he'd built and everything he'd been for 20 years. She looked at the road. Pull over, she said. What? Pull over, right now. He pulled to the gravel shoulder and put it in park and looked at her. She turned in her seat to face him. Say it clearly, she said. Say what this actually costs you. Don't make me guess. His jaw worked. He looked out through the windshield. You know what it costs. I want to hear you say it, because I need to know if you've actually decided, or if you're still figuring out whether there's a version where you don't have to pay. He was quiet. The engine idled. A hawk moved somewhere overhead against the gray sky. I've decided, he said. Then say it. He turned and looked at her, and she saw it again. That thing in his face that wasn't steadiness. That was something harder and more honest than steadiness. I give Foles's documents to the task force, he said. Everything. Marcus, the network, the shell companies, all of it. And everything attached to my name in those documents. And there will be things attached to my name. I don't contest. I cooperate. Fully. He held her gaze. And then I take whatever's coming. The gravel shoulder was quiet. A truck went by on the road, loud and fast and gone. Okay, Elena said. Okay, he repeated, like he needed to hear it from someone else to make it solid. She turned forward again. Drive. Let's find Foles. He put the car in gear. They pulled back onto the highway. 20 minutes later, they turned down the county road toward the address Foles had sent. The farmhouse sat at the end of a gravel drive, surrounded by fields and a stand of old oaks that had dropped most of their leaves. It looked empty, lights off, no car in the drive. Damien slowed to a stop 200 yards out. "Something's wrong," he said. Elena looked at the house. Nothing moved. "How long ago did he send the message?" "Yesterday morning." "And no follow-up?" "No." She looked at the front door of the farmhouse. It was standing open, not wide, just a few inches, the way a door stands when the latch hasn't caught, the way it stands when someone left in a hurry or was taken out without the chance to pull it shut. Damien's hand moved to the gun. "If Marcus already has Foles," Elena said slowly, "then Marcus already has the documents. Or he has Foles and is trying to find out if copies exist. Either way." "Either way," Damien said. "Everything I just told you about going to the task force depends on physical documentation that may already be in Marcus Hale's hands." He was very still. "And Marcus knows we're trying to find Foles, which means he knows we're 40 miles from where we were, which means the window we had is gone." The open door of the farmhouse moved slightly in the wind. Just an inch, back and forth. Elena heard herself say very quietly, "Damien, I see it." Movement in the tree line, three, maybe four figures, too deliberate to be anything but what they were. The car was already moving before she finished processing it. Damien had the engine floored and the wheel cranked hard right, and they were off the gravel drive and across the frozen field, the sedan bouncing and fishtailing on uneven ground, and Elena grabbed the dash and said nothing because there was nothing useful to say, and the tree line was behind them now, and she could hear, faintly through the closed windows and the engine noise, the sound of vehicles starting somewhere in the oaks, engines turning over rough and angry in the cold morning air. Damien drove the field like he'd driven it before, which he hadn't, which meant he was reading the ground at 60 miles an hour and making decisions in fractions of seconds. Ditch on the left, fence line ahead, gap in the fence where a post had rotted out and the wire hung slack. He hit the gap without slowing, and the sedan screamed through it, and then they were on a dirt access road running parallel to the highway, hidden from the county road by a low ridge, and he finally eased off the gas. Elena let go of the dashboard. Her knuckles ached. "They were waiting," she said. "Yes." "They knew we were coming." "Yes." She turned to look at him. His jaw was set, and his eyes were on the access road, but she could see him working through it. The same calculation she was running, arriving at the same answer. "The burner message," she said. "Foles didn't send it." Damien's hands tightened on the wheel. "Marcus sent it, using Foles's phone. He said it quietly, the way you say something that lands like a fist. Foles is already gone. The message was a flag to find out how close I was, whether I'd come to him." "And you did." "And I did." The access road curved and met a paved county route. Damien stopped at the junction and sat for a moment with the engine running and his eyes moving across every visible line of the landscape. "The documents," Elena said. "Foles had them on paper. If Marcus has Foles, then Marcus has the only physical copies." He looked at her. His face was stripped of everything except the truth of what they were facing, and the truth was this. The only leverage they'd had was gone. The trap had worked, and Marcus Hale now knew exactly where they were and exactly how little they had left. There was no more running, no more waiting for a better moment or a safer position or someone else to hand them a way out. They had nothing except each other and whatever Damien still knew from 15 years inside the machine he'd built. "Then we go to Marcus directly," Elena said. Damien looked at her like she'd said something in a language he hadn't expected her to speak. "I know where he'll be," she said. "I know because you told me once, years ago, that when everything collapses he goes to ground in the same place every time, the mill on the Caro River." She held his gaze. "He'll be waiting for us to run. So we don't run." Damien was quiet for 3 full seconds. "If we go there," he said, "there's no coming back from it." "I know," Elena said. "Drive." The Caro River Mill sat 12 miles outside a town that didn't appear on most maps anymore, Delwich, which had been a working community once, before the textile industry hollowed it out and left the buildings standing like teeth in a dead mouth. The mill was the largest structure remaining. 5 stories of 19th century brick, the river running black and fast below it, the water wheel long since frozen in place by rust and neglect. Damien had used it twice in 15 years as a last resort consolidation point. The kind of place you fell back to when everything else had been compromised. The kind of place only the people closest to you ever learned about, which meant Marcus knew it. Elena understood that as they drove. She didn't say it because Damien already knew it, and saying obvious things to Damien Voss had never accomplished anything except making him look at you with those gray eyes in a way that made you feel the weight of what you'd just wasted. They stopped 2 miles out and left the sedan in the lot of a collapsed grain elevator, went the rest of the way on foot, through fields of dead corn that hadn't been harvested, the stalks dry and rattling in the cold wind. The sky was low and colorless. Elena's breath came out in short, visible puffs. She hadn't eaten since the diner, and her body was beginning to register that as a problem. Damien moved differently on foot than he did behind a wheel, more deliberate, each step placed with care. His weight balanced in a way that seemed almost unconscious, like a man who had covered difficult ground at night more times than he could count. She found herself matching his rhythm without meaning to, the way you fall into step with someone you once knew the rhythm of completely. She hated that her body still knew how to do that. The mill came into view from the ridge above the river, massive, dark, the few remaining windows throwing back the gray sky. No lights, no vehicles visible from this angle. Damien crouched at the ridge line. Elena crouched beside him. "East side," he said quietly. "Loading dock. The river door is always unlocked from inside because the lock mechanism rusted out in 2016 and no one ever replaced it." "You're certain? I was here 14 months ago." She looked at the building, looked at him. "You came here alone?" "I come here alone sometimes." He said it without inflection. "It's quiet." Something about that landed in a way she hadn't expected. She let it go. "How many men does Marcus typically travel with?" "Depends on his threat assessment. If he thinks he has control of the situation, 4, 6. If he's uncertain, 12 or more." "Which is he right now?" Damien studied the mill. His eyes moved across each window, each shadow, reading the building the way she read a recipe. Systematically, nothing skipped. "He thinks he has control. He has Foles. He has the documents. He thinks we're running." He paused. "But Marcus is never fully certain about anything. It's what makes him dangerous. He's too smart to be comfortable." "So, somewhere between 6 and 12. "Yes." "And 2 of us?" "Yes." She looked at the building for another moment. Then she said, "What are we actually doing here, Damien? Walk me through it. Not the plan you're building, the real version. What do we actually have?" He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then, "We have the fact that Marcus needs me alive. He can't install himself permanently as head of what remains of the syndicate as long as I'm alive and unaccounted for. The factions that are drifting will always have doubt. He needs me to either publicly confirm his authority or to disappear in a way that's confirmed and documented. He needs your death on record. Or my cooperation, which he knows he won't get, so yes, my death on record. And that means he won't shoot us the moment we walk in. It means he'll want to talk first. And while he's talking, I find out where he's keeping Foles, or what's left of Foles." He said the second part without change of tone, which was its own kind of brutality. "And I find the documents." She thought about this. The wind moved through the dead corn behind them. "That's not a plan," she said. "That's a direction." "I know. You're going to improvise inside a building full of men who want to kill you based on a conversation you're hoping to have with a man who has spent 9 years planning exactly this moment." "Yes." She stood up. "All right." She brushed dead corn silk off her jacket. "River door on the east side." He looked up at her. Something moved in his face. "You don't have to come inside." "You said 2 days ago that you needed me." She met his eyes. "I'm holding you to that. Move." The river door opened exactly as he'd said, a heavy steel panel that swung inward on hinges that screamed with rust no matter how slowly you moved it. They were inside before the echo finished. The ground floor of the mill was vast and dark, the air carrying decades of flour dust and river damp, and something metallic underneath. What machinery remained was enormous and still. Iron rollers, millstones, conveyor frames, all of it frozen in the posture of interrupted work. Damien moved left immediately, putting a stone column between himself and the open floor. Elena followed. They stood in the dark and listened. Above them, somewhere on the third or fourth floor, she could hear voices. More than two. The specific low murmur of men waiting, the occasional scrape of a boot on a wooden floor. Damien's mouth was close to her ear. Staircase is through the east wall. There's a second staircase on the far west end, but it collapsed 4 years ago, one way up. They'll have someone on the stairs. Yes. Then we don't use the stairs. She looked at the machinery, at the conveyor frame running from the ground floor upward through a ceiling opening, at the iron ladder bolted to the inside of the east wall, half hidden behind a bank of rusted rollers. That ladder. He followed her eyes, looked at the ladder, looked at her. It hasn't been tested in... It's iron and it's bolted to brick. It'll hold. She was already moving. The ladder held. It shrieked twice, once when Elena first put her weight on it, once when Damien followed. And both times they stopped and held still and waited, and the voices above continued without change. They came up through the ceiling opening into what had been the second-floor processing room, a wide space broken up by support columns and the hulking shapes of dormant equipment. Light was coming from above, not much, a lantern or two, throwing warm yellow shapes down through gaps in the third-floor boards. And there were voices. Clearer now. Marcus Hale's voice she recognized immediately. She'd met him 4 times during her 3 years with Damien. He had a voice like river gravel, low, unhurried, the kind of voice that never raised itself because it had never needed to. A voice that assumed attention. He was saying, not a question of when he arrives. He'll arrive. He doesn't have a choice, and he knows it. The question is what condition he's in when he does. Another voice, younger, said something she couldn't make out. Then double the south approach, Marcus said, and get Foles some water. He's no good to me unconscious. Elena looked at Damien. Foles was alive, the word water. He was here, in this building, and he was alive. Damien's expression had done something very specific. She recognized it. The look of a man whose calculation has just been revised. They moved along the second floor, slow and careful, to the base of the interior staircase. 2 steps up was a landing, and on the landing stood a man with his back to the stairs, watching the second floor from the landing window. Large, still, clearly bored in the way of someone who'd been standing watch for hours. Damien handled it in approximately 5 seconds. She didn't watch the mechanics of it. She watched the third-floor ceiling and listened for any change in the voices above. And when he came back to her, she didn't ask and he didn't explain, and they went up the stairs. The third floor opened in front of them, and for a moment Elena simply took it in. The lantern light, the assembled men, the layout of the space. 6 armed men that she could count immediately. Marcus Hale standing near the north windows with his back to the river, exactly where a man would stand who wanted to see the room and have something solid behind him. A folding table with papers on it, and to Marcus's left, seated in a chair with his wrists zip-tied to the armrests, a small man in his 50s with a bloodied nose and the exhausted inward look of someone who had already decided how the next hours were going to go. Garrett Foles looked up. He saw them. His expression didn't change. Not a flicker, not a warning look, nothing that would flag them to the room. That told her something. It told her that Foles had been waiting for someone to come, that some part of him had believed someone might. Marcus Hale turned around. He looked exactly like she remembered. Compact, medium height, a face that was almost kind in its blandness. Nothing threatening in the architecture of it, no obvious menace. He was 61 years old, and he looked like someone's accountant. He had always looked like that, she thought. That was the thing about Marcus that made him more dangerous than men who looked dangerous. He saw Damien first. Something crossed his face, a rapid sequence of things, and then it settled into something that looked absurdly like satisfaction. There he is, Marcus said, like a man at a dinner party welcoming a late arrival. The 6 men in the room moved, weapons up, positions adjusted, the room reorganizing itself around the new variables. Nobody fired. Marcus had given no order to fire. Easy, Damien said. He had his gun out but held low, The gesture of a man making a point, not pulling a trigger. He moved into the room, and Elena came in 3 steps behind him, and she felt the attention of 6 men land on her simultaneously, that specific weight, and she looked at the table with the papers on it instead of at any of the faces. "Elena Cross," Marcus said. He said it with the tone of a man identifying something he's been expecting. "I didn't think he'd bring you in. I thought you'd be smarter than that." "I'm here because I chose to be," she said. "That's what everyone says right before they realize they didn't choose anything." He looked at Damien. "You look tired." "Where's the copy?" Damien said. Which copy?" "Don't." Damien's voice was flat and cold and absolutely without patience. "The documentation Foles assembled, the full financial record. You have the physical copies. You took them when you took him. Where are the digital backups?" Marcus smiled. It was a small smile, the smile of a man who'd been waiting for a specific question. "That's what you came for? The documentation?" "Among other things." "Damien." Marcus clasped his hands in front of him, easy and composed. "The documentation doesn't matter anymore. He gestured at the table, at the papers, at the room. "None of this matters anymore. You've missed what actually happened." Elena watched Damien's jaw tighten. 3 hours ago, Marcus said, "I made contact with the Federal Organized Crime Task Force, Region 4. I offered them a full cooperation agreement." He let that sit, watched Damien's face. "I've been building that offer for 6 months. Full disclosure on the Voss Syndicate's financial network, its operational structure, its affiliate organizations, names, accounts, transactions, everything." He paused. "My name notably appears in a supporting capacity throughout most of those records. The name that appears in an operational capacity, as founder, as principal, as the person whose decisions authorized the majority of the network's activities for 15 years. He tilted his head. "You can guess whose name that is." The room was very quiet. Elena heard the river below the building, fast and cold. "You went to the task force," Damien said. His voice had gone somewhere she'd never heard it go. Somewhere below anger. "As the cooperating witness." "As the cooperating witness," Marcus confirmed, "which means every document Foles assembled, every record, every transaction is now in federal hands, under my name as the person who provided it, under my testimony as to its meaning." He spread his hands. "You were going to use those documents to hand me to the authorities. I simply handed myself first and handed you with me." Damien didn't move, didn't speak. "There's a federal warrant," Marcus said almost gently. "Issued this morning, your name. 15 counts to start. They'll add more when they've had time to read everything properly." Elena's blood had gone somewhere cold and distant. She understood in one consolidated moment what Marcus had done. Not just stolen the documentation, not just taken Foles. He had spent months building the alternative version, the version where he was the witness, the cooperator, the man who helped, and Damien was the architect of everything that had happened in the last 15 years. And because Marcus had been meticulous and patient, and had sat inside the machine for 15 years learning exactly which levers to pull, that version was not entirely false. It was the truth bent into a particular shape, and bent truth was the hardest kind to fight. "You've been planning this since before I found out about the conspiracy," Damien said. "I've been planning this since the moment I realized you were going to eventually find the thread." Marcus looked at him without malice, which was somehow worse than malice. "You're the most thorough person I've ever known, Damien. I always knew you'd find it eventually, so I made sure that when you did, the finding of it was too late." "Garrett." Damien turned to look at Foles. Foles met his eyes. His face was damaged, but his eyes were clear. "Everything you gave him," Damien said. "Is there anything he doesn't have? Anything you held back?" Foles's eyes moved to Marcus, then back to Damien. Marcus said, "Garrett, don't." And then Foles said in a voice that was quiet and rough from hours of not being used, "Server, Zurich. Account number starts with 774. He said it fast and flat like something he'd been saving. "He doesn't have the server access. He has the documents, but not the transaction authentication records, the original ledger entries. Those are still there." Marcus's composure cracked. Just the surface of it, a fracture. quickly controlled, but Elena saw it, and she knew Damien saw it because she saw his posture change. "Those records," Damien said, still to Foles, "what do they show?" "They show authorization chains." Foles's voice was steadier now, as if saying it out loud was making it more real to him. Every major transaction, every structural decision, every affiliate agreement, with timestamps, with the login credentials of whoever authorized each entry. He took a breath. Marcus was the administrator of the financial system for 6 years. Every authorization in that period carries his credentials. Not yours. You never touched the system directly. You dealt through him. The silence in the room was total. Marcus said, very quietly, "Garrett." "I'm tired," Foles said. He sounded it. 9 kinds of tired, the kind that went down to the bone and below. "I'm just very tired." Marcus looked at his 6 men. Elena watched him make the calculation. Watched his eyes move to her and to Damien and to Foles and back. And she watched him arrive at the decision that a man like Marcus always arrived at eventually. The decision that control of the situation mattered more than anything else, including the civility that had made the conversation possible. "Take them," Marcus said. The room exploded into motion, and Elena did the only thing she could do, which was move before she had decided to move, because her body had been in Damien's world long enough to know that the moment after the order was given was the only moment worth anything, and she went left toward the table while Damien went right, and the first shot fired by someone who hadn't calibrated his aim hit the stone column 4 inches from her head, and flour dust from somewhere in the walls rained down in a fine white cloud, and Elena grabbed the papers from the table, all of them, whatever was there, in both hands. And she went for the east wall where the iron ladder came up through the floor opening, and she heard Damien's voice behind her, controlled and sharp, and the sound of the room becoming something she didn't look back at. She reached the floor opening. Went down the ladder without looking, papers pressed against her chest with one arm, the other hand and both feet finding the iron rungs in the dark. The ladder shrieked. She didn't stop. She hit the 2nd floor and crossed it at a run, into the ground floor, into the dark machinery, toward the river door. She heard feet on the stairs above her, multiple sets, the voices of men coordinating. She hit the river door with her shoulder, and it opened and the cold air came in like a wall, and she was outside, on the narrow stone ledge above the river, the water 3 feet below, black and fast and very cold. She pressed herself against the mill's exterior wall, looked right, looked left. The gravel bank was 30 feet to her right. She moved toward it, edging along the stone ledge, the river sound enormous below her, the cold working into her immediately. She made the bank, scrambled up it, turned back to the building. Damien came through the river door 40 seconds later. He was bleeding from somewhere on his left arm, the jacket sleeve dark and wet, but he was moving well enough, moving the way he always moved when something was actually wrong, which was faster. He made the bank. He looked at the papers in her hands. "Are you hit?" she said. "Graze. You have them. I have whatever was on the table. I don't know if it's what matters. It matters that Marcus thinks you have it." He was already looking upriver, calculating. "Foles. They'll move him. I know. We have maybe 3 minutes before Marcus decides whether to chase us or relocate." He turned to her. His face was bleeding slightly at the temple. She hadn't noticed that inside. "There's one more thing you don't know yet." She stared at him. Something in his voice had changed in a way that made her go still. "Damien, Ruth called me 20 minutes before we went into the building. My number was in your phone. She found it when the girls were sleeping." He held her gaze. "Elena, the blue pickup didn't make it to Halifax." The cold air stopped meaning anything. The river stopped making sound. "What?" she said. "It was stopped on the highway outside Moncton. The nephew was run off the road." His voice was doing everything it could to stay level and only partially succeeding. "Ruth got a call 40 minutes ago. An unknown number, a man's voice. She couldn't feel her hands. The papers were still in them." "He said the girls were safe," Damien said. "He said they'd stay safe as long as we stopped moving and waited to be contacted." He looked at her, and his face was stripped entirely bare now. No control left, nothing managed, just the raw face of a man who had run out of ways to protect anything. Marcus doesn't just want me, Elena. He never just wanted me. He wanted leverage that I couldn't walk away from. Something that would make me stand still long enough to be put down permanently. His voice dropped to almost nothing. He has the girls. Elena stood on the gravel bank above the Caro River with stolen papers in her hands and the cold coming off the water, and she looked at Damien Voss, and something in her underwent a change that she would not be able to describe afterward. Not a breaking, because breaking implied that what came after was smaller. This was the opposite. This was the moment where everything soft and careful and protective that she had constructed over 9 years of hiding burned away completely, leaving something underneath that had always been there, that she'd spent 9 years making sure she never needed. She said, "Get up. We're going back in." Damien looked at her. "My daughters are not a bargaining chip," she said, "and Marcus Hale is not walking out of that building." She turned and walked back toward the river door, and she did not look back to see if he was following, because she already knew that he was. The river door was still open. She went through it without slowing, into the dark machinery and the flower dust and the cold river smell, and she didn't move carefully this time. She moved fast, because fast was the only currency that mattered now, and the particular fear that had been sitting in her chest since Saltline had burned into something else entirely, something that wasn't fear at all. Damien was a half step behind her. He'd pulled his gun. His arm was still bleeding, but he held it steady, and she understood then that whatever Damien Voss was underneath everything he'd built himself into, he was also this, a man who could bleed and keep moving, who had learned so long ago to separate pain from function that the separation was now structural. She took the iron ladder. He took the stairs, going fast and low, and she heard the sounds of the third floor reorganizing itself before she cleared the ceiling opening. Voices, movement, the specific urgency of men who'd expected their targets to run and were processing the information that they hadn't. She came up through the floor, and she was already moving when the first man turned and saw her, and she hit him with her shoulder before he'd finished raising his weapon, driving him sideways into the stone column hard enough that he went down and stayed. She didn't stop to verify. She moved toward the lantern light, toward the center of the room, and Damien came up the staircase on the far side simultaneously, and the room was suddenly a problem for the 6 men in it, instead of for the 2 of them. In the chaos, she saw Foles, still in the chair, still zip-tied, watching the room with that exhausted clarity. She reached him in 6 steps. She looked at the zip ties and looked at the overturned table and found what she needed, the corner of the metal table frame, sharp where the weld had broken. She pressed the tie against it and pulled, and the plastic gave on the second attempt. "Can you walk?" she said. "Yes," Foles said. "Then walk." She pulled him up and moved him toward the east wall, and she didn't look back at what Damien was doing because she trusted him to do it, and that trust arrived without argument or history, simply as a fact, the way a bone knows how to bear weight. They made the ladder, they made the ground floor, they made the river door. Behind them, above them, the sounds of the third floor were changing. Fewer voices, different quality, the sound of something that had been a controlled situation becoming something else. Foles grabbed her arm on the gravel bank. His face in the gray light was wrecked and certain. "The Zurich server," he said, breathing hard. "I can access it from any terminal. 15 minutes. Elena looked at him. Then she looked at the mill. "Then we need 15 minutes, she said, "and we need my daughters back first." Damien came through the river door 90 seconds after Elena and Foles made the bank. He was bleeding more than before. The graze on his arm had opened further, the sleeve now soaked through, and there was a new cut across his right cheekbone that hadn't been there when they'd gone in the first time. He moved without favoring anything, which meant he was running on something past pain, something older and more reliable. He looked at Foles standing on the bank, then at Elena. "3 of them are down," he said. Marcus moved. He went up to the 4th floor when it went sideways. He was breathing hard but controlled, the breath of someone managing their body like a resource they couldn't afford to waste. "He has a phone. He's already made calls." "The girls," Elena said. "I know." "Where would he have them? Physically? Right now?" Damien looked at the mill, at the river. He was running geography and logistics and the particular knowledge of Marcus Hale's operational habits through whatever part of his mind handled those calculations. and she watched him do it and said nothing because interrupting that process would cost them. Marcus keeps a secondary location within 20 miles of any primary site, he said. Always. It's how he thinks. Nested contingencies, never one layer. The Delwich site is the primary. The secondary will be somewhere with controlled access and minimal civilian presence. He looked east along the river. There's a decommissioned water treatment facility 4 miles downstream. I used it once, 8 years ago, for a transfer. Marcus arranged it. So he knows it. He knows everything I ever used. He met her eyes. He's been studying me for 15 years. Every location, every contact, every habit. That's the secondary. I'd bet everything on it. Elena thought about Ivy's gray eyes in the dark of the motel room. Thought about Noelle's hand reaching for her sisters in the back seat of the car. Then that's where we go, she said. There are still men in that building. You said 3 down. 3 down, 3 unaccounted for, plus Marcus. And Marcus won't come out until he hears from whoever has the girls, which means we have a window. She turned to Foles. How long for the Zurich access? 15 minutes once I have a terminal. Laptop, tablet, anything with a browser. Can you do it on a phone? Foles hesitated. Slower. 25 minutes. Damien reached into his jacket and pulled out the burner phone and handed it to Foles without discussion. Start now. Walk and work. Foles looked at the phone, looked at the mill looming above them. Then he took the phone and started moving, and his fingers were already on the screen before they'd gone 10 steps. They went along the riverbank, away from the mill, into the dead grass and willow scrub that lined the Carrow's edge. The ground was soft and gave under their feet, the cold working up through the soles of their shoes. Elena's hands had stopped feeling the temperature. She registered this as information and set it aside. The water treatment facility appeared through the scrub after 20 minutes of hard walking. A cluster of concrete structures, low and utilitarian, surrounded by a chain-link fence that had been cut in at least 2 places and never properly repaired. A single gravel access road ran in from the east. One vehicle parked inside the fence, a black SUV, same model as the one that had been parked at the motel lot in Merritt Falls. They stopped in the scrub line, crouched, looked. One vehicle, Elena said quietly. Visible. There could be another on the far side of the main block. How many men would Marcus assign to hold 2 children? If he thinks it's secure, 2, maybe 3. He studied the fence line. If he's uncertain, which he is now because the mill went wrong, he'll have called for more, but they won't have arrived yet. So we have minutes. We have minutes. She looked at the SUV, at the main concrete block, which had 2 visible entry points, a roll door on the near face and a standard entry door on the side. At the fence cut nearest to them, 20 feet of open ground between the scrub and the chain link. I go first, she said. Elena, I go first because if they see me coming, I'm a woman alone, and they take an extra half-second to assess before they act. You use that half-second. She held his gaze. Don't argue with me. He looked at her for exactly 1 second, then he nodded. She crossed the 20 feet at a walk, not a run, because running was a signal and walking was ambiguous. She went through the fence cut. The chain link caught at her jacket, and she pulled free without stopping, and crossed the gravel to the side entry door and put her hand on it and looked back once at the scrub line. She couldn't see Damien, which meant neither could anyone else. She opened the door and went in. The interior was a single vast space divided by low concrete partitions and the hulking cylinders of decommissioned treatment tanks. The smell was chemical and old, something that had been processed here for decades and left its ghost behind. Fluorescent lights, 2 of them working, the rest dead, threw a flat institutional light over the concrete floor. She saw the men first, 2 of them, near the far partition, both turning at the sound of the door. She saw the girls a half-second later. Ivy and Noelle were sitting on the floor behind the near treatment tank, their backs against the concrete, wrists bound with the same zip ties Elena had cut from Foles's wrists an hour ago. Noelle had been crying, and her face showed it, though she wasn't crying now. Ivy was watching Elena with those gray eyes, and her face showed nothing except a quality of attention so fierce it was almost a physical force. Elena looked at the 2 men. They were looking at her. Hey, she said. She kept her voice completely ordinary. Marcus sent me. There's a problem at the mill. The taller one said, Who are you? I'm the person Marcus sent. Is there a reason you're not listening? He took a step toward her. I don't know you. Marcus doesn't explain himself, she said. That's literally his defining characteristic. The second man was reaching for his radio, and Elena was out of improvisation and out of time, and then the roll door behind the men came up fast and loud, and Damien came through it low and fast, and the room reorganized itself in approximately 3 seconds. Elena moved while the men were moving toward Damien. She crossed the distance to the treatment tank and went around it and got to the girls and got her hands on the zip ties and looked for the edge of anything sharp and found the corner of the tank's steel access panel and did what she'd done with Foles, pressing and pulling, and the first tie gave, and she got Noelle's wrists free and started on Ivy's. Behind her, the sounds of the room were not good. She heard something impact concrete and heard a sound from Damien that she hadn't heard from him before. A short, involuntary sound. The sound a body makes when it absorbs more than it was prepared for. Ivy's tie gave. Elena turned. Damien had one of the men down. The other had him from behind, an arm across his throat. And Damien was in the process of dealing with that in a way that required all of his remaining capacity because his left arm, the grazed one, the already bleeding one, was failing him, the strength in it inconsistent, and the man behind him was using that. Elena picked up the steel access panel. It was 2 feet by 18 inches and heavier than she'd expected, and she swung it with both hands at the back of the second man's head, and the sound it made was final. Silence. Damien staggered forward, caught himself on the tank, stood with his head down and his chest working. Damien, Elena was at his side. I'm fine. You're not fine. I'm functional. He straightened, looked at Ivy and Noelle. Something moved across his face that the dim fluorescent light couldn't flatten. He looked at them, and they looked at him, and nobody said anything for a moment. Noelle said, You look terrible. I know, Damien said. Are you going to pass out? No. You look like you're going to pass out. Noelle, Ivy said. I'm just saying. He's not going to pass out, Elena said. She didn't actually know this for certain, but she said it with enough authority that it functioned as fact. She looked at Damien. Foles. Still outside. He pushed off the tank, tested his weight. Still working. We need the access. We need it before Marcus regroups and before whoever he called gets here. I know. He moved toward the roll door, each step deliberate, the careful movement of a man managing a body that was presenting him with an escalating list of complaints. He stopped and looked back at the girls. Stay inside this building. Don't go near the windows. Noelle stared at him. Then she said, Okay. They went out through the roll door. Foles was crouched against the exterior wall of the facility with the burner phone in both hands, his broken nose dripping steadily onto the gravel that he was ignoring with the focus of a man solving a problem that mattered more than his face. How close? Damien said. 2 minutes, maybe less. Foles didn't look up. The authentication is running. If it accepts the credentials, I'm in. Elena looked at the access road. Empty. The sky overhead had gone from gray to the darker gray of late afternoon, the light failing in that flat winter way that gave no warning and no gradation. Marcus knows the mill went wrong, she said. He'll have called everyone available. How long before they arrive? Damien looked at the road. 40 minutes. Less if they were already in transit. 40 minutes is enough, Foles said. If this works. What happens if it doesn't? Elena asked. Foles finally looked up. His eyes behind the damage to his face were steady and exhausted and completely honest. Then Marcus walks. His cooperation agreement with the task force stands. Damien's name is the one attached to 15 years of organized crime, and the only people who can contradict the narrative are standing in this parking lot. Elena looked at Damien. He was looking at the phone in Foles' hands. Then Foles said, I'm in. The three of them looked at the phone screen, numbers and account identifiers and transaction chains scrolling in a dense, undramatic column that contained in its entirety the evidence of what Marcus Hale had built and what he'd done and whose hands had actually touched the controls. "Screenshot everything," Damien said. "Already doing it." Foles was moving fast now, the exhaustion still there, but something energized underneath it, the specific energy of a person who has been waiting a long time to do one useful thing. "I'm pushing copies to 3 email addresses simultaneously. My contact at the task force, a journalist I trust, and," he glanced at Damien, "a lawyer whose name you gave me 4 years ago, before you knew what I'd eventually need it for." Damien frowned. "Cassidy. She said you'd remember." Something shifted in Damien's face. "I gave you her number 4 years ago. You gave it to me and told me if I ever found myself holding something I couldn't carry alone, she was the person to call." Foles kept his eyes on the phone. "I called her yesterday, before the farmhouse, before Marcus's people came. She has a full briefing and she's been waiting to receive this." Elena looked at Damien. He was looking at Foles with an expression she couldn't entirely read, the expression of a man learning something about his own past that he hadn't known was there. "You planned for this," Damien said. "You planned for this," Foles said, 4 years ago, without knowing you were doing it. You gave me a number and told me to use it if things went wrong. I used it." He hit send on the final upload and lowered the phone and let out a breath that seemed to come from somewhere very deep. "It's gone. All of it. 5 copies in 5 places. Marcus can't unring this bell." The access road was still empty. The light was still failing. The river moved somewhere below them, cold and indifferent. Elena became aware that her hands were shaking, not from cold. She pressed them together and the shaking slowed and she breathed and it slowed further. Then Damien's burner phone, still in Foles's hand, rang. All 3 of them looked at it. Unknown number. Damien took the phone from Foles, looked at the screen, answered it, and said nothing. Marcus Hale's voice came through the speaker, river gravel low, completely composed, as if the last 4 hours had happened to someone else. "You've been busy," he said. "You have no idea," Damien said. "The mill is a problem. I'm willing to acknowledge that." A pause. "But I think you should know something before you decide what the next hour looks like." "Tell me." "The cooperation agreement with the task force isn't the only thing I filed this morning." His voice was still unhurried, still carrying that assumption of attention. "I filed a supplemental statement regarding the welfare of 2 minor children currently in the custody of parties associated with Voss syndicate operations." A beat. "That statement names you, Damien, as a person of interest in relation to those children's safety." Elena's blood went cold. "The task force has a copy," Marcus continued. "So does a family court in Halifax. So does a specific social services office in the county where Salt Line is located." He paused. "Even if your documentation reaches whoever you sent it to, and I assume you've sent it somewhere because you're thorough, you've always been thorough, the supplemental statement creates a legal process that runs on its own timeline, one that could keep those girls in a very uncertain situation for a very long time." Another pause. "Unless we talk." Damien said nothing for 3 seconds. Elena reached over and took the phone from his hand. "Marcus," she said. A brief silence. "Elena, where are you right now?" "Somewhere comfortable." "You're still in the mill," she said. "You're on the 4th floor, and you have 1 man left, and you haven't left because leaving means moving, and moving means exposure, and exposure is the one thing you've spent your entire career avoiding." She said it flat and certain. "You built everything you have from behind other people, from inside structures where someone else's name was on the door. You've never once in your life stood in the open and been the thing you actually are." Silence. "Come down," she said. "Come down from that building and stand in the open and say what you did. All of it. What you did to us. What you did to those girls. What you've been for 15 years. Her voice was steady in a way she would not have predicted. "Or I will spend every day of the rest of my life making sure that every person who ever worked with you, feared you, or deferred to you knows exactly what you are. Not a strategist, not a power broker." She took a breath. "A man who used 2 9-year-old girls as leverage because it was the only move he had left." The line was quiet. Then Marcus said softly, "You should have stayed in your bakery, Elena." "I know," she said. "I should have done a lot of things." She ended the call. She looked at Damien. He was looking back at her with an expression she'd last seen 9 years ago. The expression of a man who has encountered something that moves him in a way he doesn't have architecture for. "He's still in the mill," she said. "Yes. And the legal filings. Cassidy can counter them. The supplemental statement falls apart without the financial narrative to support it, and the financial narrative is now in 5 places that aren't his." He paused. "It'll take time, but it falls apart." "How much time?" "Days. Maybe a week?" She thought about Ivy and Noel inside the facility, thought about a week of uncertainty, of legal processes running on their own momentum, of her daughters in the middle of something they hadn't chosen. "Then we finish it tonight," she said. Damien looked at her. "He's alone or close to it," she said. "He's in a building he knows I know. He's made every move he had, and none of them landed clean." She held Damien's gaze. "He's not a man who survives standing in the open, so we make him stand in the open. Elena, if we go back to that building, I know what it means. There's no controlled version of what happens in there. Not anymore." "I know that too." She looked at the access road, at the failing light, at the river moving in the distance below the scrub line. "The girls stay here with Foles. You and I go back to the mill." She turned to face him fully. "And we end this. Not because we have no choice, because we're choosing to. Because I'm done letting Marcus Hale define what our lives look like." Damien stood in the gravel lot with blood drying on his sleeve and his face and his chest moving with the controlled breath of a man who was tired all the way through and had decided to keep going anyway. "Okay," he said. She turned toward the scrub line and the river and the mill somewhere beyond it, dark against the darkening sky. Behind her, she heard Damien say, quietly enough that it might not have been meant for her, "I should have looked harder." She stopped, didn't turn. 9 years, he said. "I should have looked harder." She stood there for a moment with the cold on her face and the sounds of the river in the distance. "You're looking now," she said, and she walked toward the scrub line and the river and whatever was waiting in the mill, and this time she didn't check whether he was following because the sound of his footsteps on the gravel behind her told her everything she needed to know, and the last of the daylight died above the tree line as they disappeared into the scrub together, moving toward the Caro River and the dark shape of the mill beyond it. The river door was still open. Nobody had secured it. That told her something about the state of things inside. A man in control secured his perimeter. A man running out of options left doors open because he was thinking about what came next, not what was behind him. They went in the same way they'd gone in before. Ground floor dark, machinery still, flour dust settling in the beam of the small flashlight Damien had taken from the water treatment facility. He moved left. She moved right. The iron ladder on the east wall waited where it had always been. She took it. 4 floors this time. Her arms burned on the 3rd landing, and she climbed through it because burning arms were not a reason to stop. The 4th floor was different from the 3rd. Lower ceilinged, the river-facing wall partially open to the elements where the brick had failed, the sound of the Caro filling the space. 1 lantern still burning in the northeast corner, throwing a small circle of yellow light. Marcus Hale stood in that circle of light. He was alone. No weapon visible, though that meant nothing. He looked at them the way he looked at everything, with the steady assessment of a man who is always counting. "You came back," he said. "We came back," Damien said. "That's either very brave or very stupid." "Probably both," Elena said. Marcus looked at her, then at Damien. The calculation in his eyes was still running, but something else had entered it. Something that looked for the first time like an acknowledgement of a particular kind of math. The math of a man who has played every card and watched them all fail. "The documentation is gone," Damien said. "Foles sent it 40 minutes ago. Cassidy has it. The task force has it. It's done, Marcus." Marcus said nothing. "The supplemental statement falls without the financial narrative. You know that." Damien moved closer, slow, deliberate, the walk of a man who wasn't performing anything. There's one version of tonight where you walk out of here and you make this harder and longer and more expensive for everyone. And there's one version where you stop. And why would I stop? Because you're tired, Elena said. The same way Foles was tired. The same way everyone gets tired eventually of holding something this heavy. She looked at him across the fourth floor of the ruined mill, the river loud below them, and the cold coming through the broken wall. Put it down, Marcus. The lantern flickered. The river ran. Marcus Hale looked at Damien Voss for a long moment, and something in his face moved through several things and arrived at something that wasn't surrender exactly, but was the thing just before it, the moment when the body understands what the mind hasn't admitted yet. He reached into his jacket with 2 fingers and produced his phone and set it carefully on the floor in front of him. I want a lawyer, he said. You'll get one, Damien said. And the mill went quiet around them, finally, for the first time. The federal agents arrived at the Caro River Mill at 9:47 in the evening. Elena knew they were coming because Cassidy, the lawyer Damien had named without knowing he was naming her 4 years ago for exactly this purpose, had called Foles's burner 40 minutes after the documentation landed in her inbox. And Cassidy was the kind of woman who moved like she was always already 3 steps into the next problem. She said she'd contacted Region 4 directly. She said she'd transmitted everything. She said the authentication records from the Zurich server were, in her professional assessment, the cleanest piece of financial evidence she'd seen in 22 years of criminal defense and prosecution work, and that Marcus Hale's cooperation agreement was going to unravel inside of 72 hours. She also said, without being asked, that the supplemental statement regarding the minor children had been flagged for immediate review given the context of the full financial disclosure, and that the family court filing in Halifax was being contested as of that afternoon. Elena had listened to all of this standing in the gravel lot of the water treatment facility with Foles beside her and the sounds of Ivy and Noel moving inside the building behind her. And when Cassidy finished, she said, "Thank you," and ended the call and stood in the dark for a moment, just breathing. Then she went inside and sat on the concrete floor next to her daughters and didn't say anything. And Noelle leaned into her left side and Ivy leaned into her right side, and the 3 of them sat like that while Foles kept watch at the roll door, and the night came down fully over Delwich and the river and the ruined mill 4 miles upstream. Damien came back 40 minutes later. He'd stayed at the mill to wait for the agents, which was the right call and the difficult call and the kind of call that cost something to make. He came in through the side entry door and stood in the facility space and looked at the 3 of them on the floor, and his face did the thing it had been doing since the kitchen and salt line. That unmanaged thing, the thing he'd spent 20 years learning not to show. He sat down on the concrete across from them. He looked at his hands for a moment. Then he looked at Ivy. "I know you have questions," he said. Ivy looked at him. "I have approximately 40 questions." "I know. I'm not going to ask them tonight." Something shifted in his expression. "Okay. But I'm going to ask them," she said, "all 40, and you're going to answer them." "Yes," he said. "I am." Noelle, from Elena's left side, said, "I have 60 questions." "Of course you do," Damien said. "Is that a problem?" "No." And for the first time since he'd walked through the bakery door and salt line, something crossed Damien Voss's face that was not calculation or control or the managed stillness of a man who'd learned to keep everything below the surface. Something that was simpler and more costly than any of those things. "It's not a problem at all." The federal agents processed the mill for 6 hours. Marcus Hale was taken into custody at the vehicle gate at 10:15, his wrists in restraints, his face carrying the particular expression of a man in the middle of a very long internal recalibration. He didn't speak when they walked him out. He looked straight ahead, chin level, the composure intact because for a man like Marcus, the composure was the last thing to go, and possibly the last thing he actually owned. Elena watched from the tree line as they put him in the vehicle. She'd walked up to the ridge above the mill after the girls were asleep in the back seat of a car Cassidy had arranged. A real car this time, a woman from Cassidy's office at the wheel, someone whose name Elena knew and whose face she'd confirmed before the girls got in. She'd watched from the ridge, and she'd thought about standing in a hospital room 9 years ago with 2 pink-faced newborns and a phone call she'd believed, completely and without question, because the voice on the other end was Marcus Hales, and he'd had 9 years of practice at being the person Damien trusted most, which meant he'd had 9 years of practice at being the person Elena trusted by extension. She thought about that. She let herself think about it fully, the way you have to let yourself look at a wound to understand its actual depth. The years of running, the bakery and the flour, and the 4 a.m. mornings, and the particular loneliness of being the only person who knew the complete truth of your own life. The way she told herself every day that she'd made the right choice, and the way she'd never fully believed it, and the way she now understood that both things had been true simultaneously, that she'd been deceived into making a choice she hadn't actually needed to make, and that the life she'd built from that choice was still real, still hers, still worth the cost of having lived it. The federal vehicle pulled out of the mill lot and its headlights swept the tree line, and then it was gone down the county road. Elena stood on the ridge for a while longer. The river ran below her, the sound of it constant and uninvested in any of this. She found that she appreciated that. The next weeks were not simple. She hadn't expected them to be. Cassidy had warned her, in the practical and non-gentle way of someone who'd been doing this long enough to have stopped cushioning her assessments, that legal processes moved on their own schedule, and that schedule bore no relationship to human emotional readiness. There were statements to give. There were interviews with federal investigators who were thorough and professional and who asked her questions that required her to speak aloud about things she'd only ever carried silently. There were the family court proceedings in Halifax, which resolved in 11 days in a way that left no ongoing legal cloud over the girls. But 11 days was 11 days, and each of them had weight. Damien gave his full cooperation. Everything, the complete operational history of the Voss Syndicate, its affiliate networks, its financial architecture as he understood it, every decision that had carried his authorization during 15 years at the head of an organization built on things that didn't survive daylight examination. He sat across tables from federal investigators for 4 days straight, and he answered every question they put to him without redirection and without the kind of strategic omission that would have come naturally to a man of his training and experience. Elena knew this because Cassidy told her. She didn't know it from Damien directly, because Damien was in a federal building in a city 2 hours away, and the terms of his cooperation agreement restricted his contact with people connected to the investigation, which included her, for the duration of the active process. She took the girls to Halifax, Ruth's house, the basement room, the 2 Rottweilers who were named Samuel and Clark, and who immediately and permanently attached themselves to Noelle, who named them Sam and Clarky within 20 minutes, and told Elena that if they couldn't keep them, she was going to be extremely unhappy about it. Elena said they couldn't keep them, and Noelle said that was an incorrect answer, and Ivy said, without looking up from the book she was reading, that they should probably focus on having a home before they worried about what would be in it. That landed the way Ivy's observations always landed, with the quiet authority of something true. Elena lay awake in Ruth's guest room on the 12th night and thought about what home meant now. The Salt Line Bakery was in the hands of a property manager she'd called from the water treatment facility parking lot, a woman named Deb who'd always wanted to run the place, and who'd said yes so fast Elena suspected she'd been waiting for the question. The apartment above it was being held. Deb was keeping the ovens on. She thought about flour, about 4 a.m. and brown butter and cardamom, about the particular quality of those hours that had always belonged to her and that she hadn't lost, she realized. She'd carried them with her. They were a thing she'd built into herself rather than into a location, and that distinction mattered in a way she hadn't understood until she tried to imagine losing it. She thought about what Damien had said on the gravel shoulder of the county road, before the farmhouse and the mill and the 4th floor and all of it. I've decided. The flatness of it. The cost of it. She thought about the question she hadn't asked because the moment hadn't allowed it. What he decided about after. Not about Marcus, not about the syndicate, not about the investigation. After. What a man like Damien Voss did with the rest of his life, when the thing that had defined the majority of it was gone. She fell asleep before she found the answer and dreamed nothing she remembered. Garrett Foles testified before the federal grand jury on a Thursday in November. Elena knew the date because Cassidy's office sent a brief update. Standard procedure, nothing requiring her response. She read it at Ruth's kitchen table with Samuel's head on her left foot and thought about Foles in the farmhouse with his broken nose and his exhausted honesty, and the Zurich account number he'd held back like a last coin. She hoped he was all right. She thought he probably was. People who had been carrying something for a long time often were, once they'd finally set it down. The indictment of Marcus Hale came through on the following Monday. 41 counts. The cooperation agreement he'd filed with such careful preparation was voided in its entirety once the authentication records established that the financial narrative he'd offered as a cooperating witness was a deliberately constructed misdirection, true in its facts, false in its attribution. The federal prosecutor, according to Cassidy, described it in chambers as one of the most sophisticated attempts at preemptive narrative control she'd encountered in 18 years. Marcus would receive no credit for cooperation. He would receive the full weight of 41 counts, to which additional charges were likely to be added as the investigation completed its scope. Elena read this update also at Ruth's kitchen table. She set her phone down and drank her coffee and looked out the window at Ruth's backyard, the 6-foot fence, the dead November grass, and she felt something she hadn't expected to feel, which was not satisfaction and not relief, but something more like the absence of a weight she'd grown so accustomed to carrying that she'd stopped being able to feel its edges. It was gone now. She could feel where it had been. Damien called on a Wednesday evening in the 3rd week of November, which meant the active restriction on contact had been lifted, which meant the cooperation process had reached a stage where that was permitted. Elena was in the backyard with Noelle, who was throwing a tennis ball for Samuel and Clark with the specific dedication of a person who had already decided the outcome of the debate about keeping them. She looked at the phone, looked at Noelle, went inside. "How are they?" he said. No preamble, no greeting, the question he'd been holding since the water treatment facility. "They're good," Elena said. She sat at the kitchen table. Noelle has emotionally adopted Ruth's dogs. Ivy has read 11 books in 3 weeks and critiqued 7 of them in writing. A pause on the line. She could hear him breathing. "That sounds right." "It does." Another pause. "The investigation is... Cassidy keeps me updated." "Okay." He was quiet for a moment. "I wanted to tell you myself, about the cooperation, about what I gave them. I know what you gave them. I wanted you to hear it from me that I didn't hold anything back." She looked at the kitchen window. "I know, Damien. You know because Cassidy told you." "I know because I know you," she said. "When you said you'd decided, you'd decided. That's not a thing that changes with you." The line was quiet. Outside, Noelle laughed at something Samuel had done, the sound of it coming through the window, bright and uncomplicated. "I don't know what comes after this," Damien said. It came out plainly, without the management she was used to hearing underneath his words. Just the plain fact of it, said by a man who had spent 20 years knowing exactly what came next and was now in the unprecedented position of not knowing. "I've been trying to... I keep looking for the next move and there isn't one. Not the way there used to be." "I know," she said. "I don't know how to do that." "I know that too." She was quiet for a moment. "I didn't know how to do it either. When I got to Salt Line, I didn't know how to be a person who wasn't waiting for something to go wrong. It took about 2 years before I could stand in my own kitchen without scanning the exits." 2 years? Give or take. "That's a long time." "It's not that long," she said, "when you consider the alternative." He was quiet again. She listened to him breathe on the other end of the line and thought about all the things that had been said and all the things that hadn't, and the specific texture of 9 years of silence between 2 people who had not stopped existing in relation to each other even across all of it. "The girls," he said. "I don't know how to ask for this." "Then say what you actually mean," she said, not unkindly. "I want to know them," he said. "I want to be someone they can know. I don't have a right to ask for that. I know I don't have a right to it, but I'm asking." Elena sat at Ruth's kitchen table and looked at the window and beyond it at the fence and the gray November sky. "Ivy has 40 questions," she said. "She told you she'd ask them." "Yes. When you're ready, when this is all the way finished and you're standing on the other side of it, you come and you sit down and you answer all 40 questions. And whatever Noelle's up to by then, You answer those too. She paused. And you do it honestly. Not the version of honest that leaves things out because they're complicated. The actual honest. Yes, he said. And you do it consistently, she said. Because they're 9 years old and they've had enough of things that start and don't continue. I understand. I need to know you understand what that means, not in a general way, specifically. It means I show up, he said, every time, whether it's comfortable or not, whether I know how to do it or not. A pause. It means I'm there. She listened to the plainness of that, the absence of qualifier. Okay, she said. The Salt Line Bakery reopened on the 14th of February, which was not a choice Elena made intentionally. It was simply the date when everything was ready, when the girls were enrolled in school again, and the apartment above the shop was cleaned and the ovens were recalibrated, and Deb had handed back the keys with a genuine warmth that suggested she'd enjoyed the temporary stewardship more than she let on. The date was coincidental. Elena noted the coincidence and decided it didn't require a response. She was at the counter at 4 a.m. the first morning back, flour on her hands, the oven warming behind her, the smell of it filling the kitchen. That particular smell, yeast and heat, and the beginning of something. The harbor dark outside the window, the town quiet and ordinary and entirely uninvested in the significance of what she'd been through. She found she loved it for exactly that reason. Ivy and Noelle were asleep upstairs. They'd argued for 45 minutes the night before about which shelf in the shared closet belonged to whom and had resolved it through a negotiation that Noelle claimed was fair and Ivy claimed was slightly in Noelle's favor, and Elena had said she didn't want to know, and they'd both looked at her with the identical expression they'd inherited from their father, and she'd felt something move through her chest that was too large to name, and so she didn't try. Damien had come in January, 3 weeks after the call, 1 week after the final cooperation session with the federal investigators. He'd driven to Halifax and called from the bottom of Ruth's street, and Elena had gone down and looked at him standing beside a car that was not the blue sedan and was not anything she recognized, which meant he'd driven something he'd gone out and chosen for himself, which was a small thing and also not a small thing. He looked different than he had in the mill. The damage to his face had healed, the cheekbone cut, the temple graze. His arm had needed stitches, which Cassidy's office had quietly arranged, and the sleeve was no longer dark with blood. He was wearing clothes that were not the clothes of a man managing a crisis. He looked like a person standing still in daylight. She wasn't sure she'd ever seen that before. They'd walked along the harbor while Ruth supervised the girls with a diplomatic neutrality that Elena suspected had been practiced. She and Damien had walked and said things and left other things unsaid, and it was neither sufficient nor insufficient. It was where they were, and where they were was not the end of anything, which was new. He'd sat with the girls for 2 hours in Ruth's kitchen. She didn't listen. She was in the backyard with Samuel's head on her foot, and she could hear through the kitchen window the low sound of Damien's voice and Noelle's questions arriving rapid fire and Ivy's slower and more precise. And she could hear him answering. All of it. The actual honest. She sat in the yard until the cold made her go back inside. She'd come in to find Noelle explaining the specific grievance about the closet shelf, and Damien listening with the focused attention of a man trying to learn a language as fast as possible, and Ivy sitting across from him with her gray eyes and her 9-year-old assessment of what he'd said so far. The assessment still running, still not complete. That was fine. The assessment didn't need to be complete yet. It needed to be underway. It was underway. Plus, on the first morning the bakery was open again, at 6:43, Elena unlocked the front door. She wiped her hands on her apron first. She turned the bolt with her left hand, the scar across the right palm aching the way it always ached in cold weather. She pulled the door open and the February air came in off the harbor, cold and salt-sharp and fully itself. The first customer was Mrs. Callahan from the insurance office across the street. She came in at 7:03, same as always, and said she'd heard the bakery was back open and she was glad because the place on Merchant Street that had been trying to cover the gap did not, in her opinion, understand what a proper almond croissant was supposed to be. Elena gave her 2. On the house. At 8:30, the girls came downstairs. Noelle was still arguing about the closet. Ivy had brought a book and set it on the counter and was reading it while eating a morning roll and managing to look completely undisturbed by the argument happening beside her. Elena watched them from the kitchen doorway. At 9 o'clock, the door opened and Damien Voss came in. He was wearing the wrong kind of jacket for the weather. Not warm enough. The jacket of a man who'd spent years moving fast between heated spaces and hadn't yet fully accounted for the experience of simply existing in cold air. He looked around the bakery the way he'd looked at everything, force of habit, the scan, and then he stopped doing it, deliberately, visibly, the way you stop a reflex you've decided you no longer need. Noelle said, "You're late." "I said 9 o'clock, he said. "It's 9:02. "Noelle," Ivy said, without looking up from her book. "I'm just saying. You're always just saying." Damien looked at Elena across the bakery. She looked back at him. There was flour on her hands and the oven was running, and the morning was doing what mornings did, which was move forward without waiting for anyone to be ready. She handed him an apron. He looked at it. It was a plain canvas apron, the one she kept on the hook by the kitchen door for whenever she needed a second pair of hands. He took it and held it for a moment, and his face moved through something quietly. "I don't know how to bake," he said. "I know," she said. "That's fine. You'll learn." He looked at the apron, looked at the kitchen behind her, looked at Ivy still reading and Noelle already reaching across the counter for a morning roll and the harbor outside the window and the ordinary, beautiful, unremarkable morning that was already well underway. He put the apron on. It took him 3 tries to get the ties right. Elena didn't help him. When he finally had it, he looked down at himself and then looked at her, and something in that look was so unguarded that she had to turn back to the oven before she said something that wasn't ready to be said yet. She pulled a tray of sourdough boule from the lower rack and set it on the cooling stand. "Start by washing your hands," she said. "Then I'll show you how to shape the rolls. It takes longer than it looks, and you'll get it wrong the first several times." "Okay," he said. "Don't argue with the dough. It doesn't respond to pressure the way you think it will." "Okay. And don't watch your hands while you work. You have to feel it." He went to the sink. She heard the water run. She stood at her counter and looked at the boule cooling on the rack. Their crusts cracked just right. Their weight and color exactly what she'd been working toward for 8.5 years. This particular loaf, this particular shade of brown, this particular morning that smelled like yeast and salt air and the specific warmth of a kitchen where something was being made from the beginning. Noelle had climbed onto the counter stool and was now engaged in telling Ivy about a dream she'd had, something about a dog who could do fractions, the details escalating with every sentence in the way Noelle's stories always escalated. Ivy was listening without looking up from her book, which was how Ivy listened, which Noelle understood and therefore didn't stop talking. Damien came back from the sink with his hands dry and looked at the counter and looked at Elena. "Show me," he said. She reached into the proofed dough bin and pulled out a portion and set it in front of him and put her own hands into her own portion and began. He watched her hands. Then he tried with his own. The dough did what dough does to someone new. It stuck and tore and went where it wasn't supposed to go, and he didn't argue with it, but she could see him wanting to, see him applying the only approach he knew to resistant things. And she said quietly, "Softer, let it come to you." And he adjusted, and it was still wrong, but it was differently wrong, which was progress. Outside, the February morning went about its business. The harbor moved, the town woke up. A few more customers came in and went out with paper bags warm from the oven. Mrs. Callahan waved through the window from across the street. Ivy put down her book at some point and watched her father's hands in the dough without saying anything. He became aware of her watching and glanced at her, and she didn't look away, and he didn't either, and something passed between them that completed one of the 40 questions without words. Noelle's story about the fraction-solving dog reached a conclusion that apparently required her to demonstrate something with her hands, which resulted in the morning roll she'd been eating going off the edge of the counter, which resulted in a brief moment of chaos that was resolved by Noelle eating the second half of the roll and declaring it still good, which Elena agreed with. Damien looked at all of this. He stood in Elena's kitchen with his hands in bread dough and flour, working its way into the creases of his palms and his daughter's on the other side of the counter and the cold harbor light through the windows, and he was quiet in a way that was completely different from the quiet she'd known in him before. The old quiet had been management. This was something else. This was a man standing still in a life he hadn't known how to want, and finding that it fit around him in a way that the other one never had. Elena worked her dough. She didn't look at him. She didn't need to. The morning rolled had the right weight in her hands. The oven behind her was at the right temperature. Her daughters were arguing again, something new, something about whether the fraction dog had also been able to do geometry. Noelle said yes. Ivy said that wasn't in the part she'd told so far. Noelle said she was getting to it. Damien said very quietly, to no one in particular, "What do I do with this now?" It wasn't quite a question. Elena answered it anyway. "You fold it," she said, "toward you. Then you turn it and fold it again. You keep doing it until it comes together." He looked down at his hands. He folded the dough toward him, turned it, folded it again. It was still imperfect, would be for a long time, would take weeks to get close to right, but it was holding its shape now, finding the beginning of a structure, becoming something that hadn't existed before. Outside the window, the salt line harbor was fully bright. The water caught the morning and held it and gave it back. The bakery smelled like bread.